Welcome to Grandpa and the Goddess of Poetry. Today I'm going to read an extraordinary poem by an extraordinary poet. It's The Idea of Order at Key West by the poet Wallace Stevens. Stevens died in 1955. He was quite prolific in the first half of the 20th century. He was an extraordinary man simply because he was outwardly very, very ordinary. He lived and worked most of his life in Hartford, Connecticut, on the east coast of the United States, where he was a lawyer and an executive for a large insurance company. He is normally pictured in photographs wearing a business suit, a plump, fairly comfortable, competent-looking person, a businessman, the sort of person you'd see on a commuter train most days, even today. But underneath, he was an extraordinarily well-educated, sensitive, and I have to say, emotional poet. He reminds me very much of his near contemporary and fellow American T.S. Eliot, who was at the same time as Stevens living most of his life in London, England. Even their poetry is in some ways similar, modernist, blank verse, extraordinarily erudite at times, and both men seem to me the very opposite of those poets of the previous century, the 19th century, people like Byron and Emily Bronte, people who were driven to write poetry by huge emotion that they just poured out onto the page through their pen, and were often suffering sort of physically as well as mentally while they were doing it. And the poets of the 20th century, so many of them, but especially the two I've mentioned, and Wallace Stevens most especially, were people who kept their emotions, at least outwardly, very much under control, yet somehow produced the most astonishingly beautiful, poetic works of art. They seemed to take a different attitude towards poetry, though in many ways the final result was just sheer beauty to equal anything that Byron or Emily Bronte or anyone else might have produced. It's very interesting how many roads there are towards a beautiful work of poetry, or perhaps of any work of art. But my passion is poetry, and I just love the way these modern poets sort of play games with one's mind, as well as pulling the strings of one's emotions. They seem to press so many buttons inside me at the same time, and it gives me enormous pleasure to read Wallace Stevens, because though my scholarship is nothing like his, I absolutely love the way he sort of in some ways has a similar background to me. I trained as an accountant at one time, and I only came to poetry later. Wallace Stevens used to travel to work each day on a commuter train, or sometimes in a chauffeur-driven car, I think, and he would write little pieces of poetry on scraps of paper, and when he arrived at his office, he would hand these scraps of paper to his secretary, and she would type them up and put them in a sort of business file of poems, and it was all very sort of efficient and outwardly very sort of cold and soulless almost. But then we judge poetry by the product, and the product that Wallace Stevens came up with was often astonishingly beautiful, and some people think his poetry is the most beautiful that has ever been written. I'll tell you my opinion in the end. I'm going to read this poem now. It's called The Idea of Order at Key West. And you say to yourself, what on earth is that going to be about? Well, it was written on a trip to Florida, Key West, with a friend whom he addresses in the poem towards the end. It was inspired by apparently hearing a woman while Wallace Stevens and his friend were walking along the beach or the coastline at Key West, Florida, and this woman was singing the most beautiful songs, and her voice was apparently astonishingly beautiful, and it made Wallace Stevens, wonder about how words and music and sounds and nature and our own thoughts and emotions all combine. And he was somebody who very much saw poetry as constructing a work of art rather than just simply sort of pouring it all out on the page. I'm going to read this poem now, and bear with me, I will do my best with it. It's a longish poem. It just relax and open your mind to the idea that you're listening in the twilight, I think, to on a beautiful hot summer evening, listening above the sound of the waves to a woman singing the most extraordinary songs that really moved the writer of this poem. And just imagine yourself in that situation. Here we are, the idea of order at Key West. She sang beyond the genius of the sea. The water never formed to mind or voice, like a body, holy body, fluttering its empty sleeves, and yet its mimic motion made constant cry, caused constantly a cry, that was not ours, although we understood, inhuman, of the veritable ocean. The sea was not a mask, no more was she. The song and water were not medleyed sound, even if what she sang was what she heard, since what she sang was uttered word by word. It may be that in all her phrases stirred the grinding water and the gasping wind, but it was she, and not the sea, we heard. For she was the maker of the song she sang. The ever-hooded, tragic-gestured sea was merely a place by which she walked to sing. Whose spirit is this, we said, because we knew it was the spirit that we sought, and knew that we should ask this often as she sang. It was only the dark voice of the sea that rose, or even coloured by many waves. It was only the outer voice of sky and cloud, of the sunken coral, water-walled. However clear, it would have been deep air, the heaving speech of air, a summer sound, repeated in a summer without end, and sound alone. But it was more than that, more even than her voice and ours, among the meaningless plunging of water and the wind. Theatrical distances, bronze shadows heaped on high horizons, mountainous atmospheres of sky and sea. It was her voice that made the sky acutest at its vanishing. She measured to the hour its solitude. She was the single artificer of the world in which she sang, and when she sang, the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song, for she was the maker. Then we, as we beheld her striding there alone, knew that there never was a world for her except the one she sang and singing made. Ramon Fernandez, tell me, if you know, why, when the singing ended and we turned towards the town, tell why the glassy lights, the lights in the fishing boats at anchor there, as the night descending, tilted in the air, mastered the night and portioned out the sea, fixing emblazoned zones and fiery poles, arranging, deepening, enchanting night. O blessed rage for order, pale Ramon, the maker's rage to order words of the sea, words of the fragrant portals dimly starred, and of ourselves and of our origins, in ghostlier demarcations, keener sounds. That's, to me, is the voice of a man in a sort of trance, listening to a beautiful, beautiful sound in a beautiful, beautiful situation, scenery, asking himself all sorts of questions, perhaps even, is this what the poetic fallacy is all about? Or is this what real beauty is about? Or is this reality at all? Or is it just a way of transporting me into a wholly different world, the world of the imagination and the senses? Wallace Stevens was such a deep thinker. Perhaps we'll never know. We only know that he won the Pulitzer Prize for his poetry, and he has left us some truly amazing new frontiers in poetry that perhaps we hadn't imagined existed. We'd been so sort of caught up in Victorian and pre-Victorian poetry, which is truly beautiful in other ways, that that element of the sort of self-questioning and mind games that modernist writers brought to us, together with, of course, amazing vocabulary and use of words in so many exciting new formats, opened the whole world of poetry up again. It was like going into not just a new room, but a whole new mansion of excitement in the poetic world. I think that poem I've just read is quite astonishing. It stays with me. It's the voice of a 20th century poet, a man, a master of his trade, probably a man who's been educated to a state where his mind is open to so much that a lot of us don't ever get close to. I think Wallace Stevens is a truly great poet, And I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.